I'm Dr. Larry Burchett, and welcome to your 5-minute weekly coronavirus update powered by Averpoint.com for August 14th, 2020. This week, we review with Shobhik Banerjee, the Averpoint founder, the numbers. Are we finally plateauing with deaths and cases? We have the debut of Dr. Jenab, MD, who will explain to you what is the cytokine storm. I will walk you through clots and how they are a significant cause of problems and death and COVID. First, let's begin with the numbers. Shobhik.
This was another week where about 1,100 people died every day in the United States from coronavirus. Now that's up 120% since July, but it's been flat for 2 weeks. So we hope we may have hit a plateau. Hospitalizations are down 10% in a week. They're down 20% in 2 weeks. New cases are down from their peak of 65,000 a day to 53,000. Now it's been flat for a week, but that's probably because California and Florida both had large backlogs from before test results that have just come in. Regionally, the South and the West are both reporting large declines in cases and hospitalizations. The Midwest, where numbers had tripled in June and July, has been flat for 2 weeks. So big picture, it looks like the United States, which saw a huge surge in June and July, is now plateauing and even declining for 2 weeks. Now, as always, there are reasons for concern. Now, first of all, testing. In Texas, daily tests have fallen from 60,000 to 30,000. The positivity rate has shot up to 25%. Now, remember, you need a 5% positivity rate to contain the virus. It's very likely that there are unreported cases in Texas, and these are spreading throughout the state. Now, the other concern are schools. Now, in urban areas, 19 of the 25 largest school districts have already said they're going virtual. But in rural regions, there's much more pressure to open physically. Last week, places in Georgia, Tennessee, other states already reopened. And one county in Georgia made headlines because within days, they had 11 schools with positive cases. They had to quarantine 1,200 students and shut down many schools. Now remember, kids can transmit the virus, especially after age 11. They can give it to each other, their parents, their teacher, their neighbors. So if these rural regions do go ahead and reopen, we'll have to pay close attention to what happens when there's an outbreak. Is there the testing capacity to stop it? And do the numbers shoot up? Now let's talk about the world, which is seeing about 1 million new cases every 4 days. Let's start with Latin America, which has been a hotspot for months. Brazil reached 100,000 deaths this week. Mexico is putting up big numbers every week. And Chile and Peru have higher per capita numbers than Brazil. So what's going on in Latin America? Now sadly, it's very similar to the parts of the US that are being disproportionately hit. Large, urban, dense populations with multi-generational living, high levels of air pollution that correlate with comorbidities, and developing country infrastructure that has fewer intensive care units. All of this comes together to make it easier for the virus to spread, harder to contain, and harder to treat once people are infected. Now let's compare two countries that contained the virus and had recent outbreaks. Japan won widespread praise for containing the virus by May without drastically shutting down their economy because the government and the people were on the same page. They were wearing masks, keeping a distance, and could still go to work. But by June, they reopened the rest of their economy very quickly. Bars, sporting events, riding crowded trains, and telling people to travel domestically. As the numbers started to go up, there was no plan to deal with the resulting outbreaks. Now compare that to their fellow island nation of New Zealand. Now, they had their first 4 cases in 100 days this week. As soon as those cases came to light, they deployed a quarantine team. They isolated those 4 people. They traced and isolated the 200 people they came in touch with. The city of Auckland went on lockdown for a few days, and the whole country's alertness level was raised. So, stepping back, we'll reiterate a point. After a country contains the virus, it remains at risk for an outbreak. If it has a national strategy, it can stop the outbreak in its track and then get their economy going again.
Okay, so let's talk about a very common complication in COVID that can be deadly. Not respiratory failure this time, but clots. What are clots? I think of 2 different kinds of clots. Clots in your veins, like a clot in a vein in your leg is a DVT, versus clots in arteries, like a clot in an artery in your heart causes a heart attack, and a clot in an artery in your brain causes a stroke. We see all of this with COVID, and even some of the severe ones. You can get a clot in an artery in your extremity. It can be amputated. You've probably heard about those cases. How much of that is going on in COVID? A fairly significant amount. Recent JAMA study out in late July looked at hospitalized COVID patients in New York. About 6% of them had clots in their veins, including clots in their legs and in their lungs. And about 11% had clots in their heart and brain, causing heart attack and stroke. About almost 9% had heart attacks with COVID. Now, some people think that we're even underestimating and underdiagnosing the amount of clots. How would you figure it out then if there are more if we're not diagnosing it in the hospital? This is really interesting. You would take COVID people who have died and you would dissect their body looking for it. That's an autopsy. There's an interesting autopsy study. They did 12 autopsies and they found, guess how many clots they found in legs that were not diagnosed before of those 12 autopsies? 7. And 4 of those guys ended up dying of clots in their lungs, which is related to clots in your legs. 7 of them undiagnosed. And many of those patients had been on blood thinners. So what do we do to prevent this? Now that we know that clotting is a big way that people can die from COVID, how do we prevent it? Initially, when I was in New York, the docs told me a lot of people were dying, so they started giving full dose blood thinners to everybody. And they noticed people started improving. Was that it? Maybe. We don't know. We need better studies. There was even a recent study that looked at giving many people full dose blood thinners. And what's the opposite of clotting? That there's this balance in the body? It's bleeding. So if we put everybody on blood thinners, there's going to be increased bleeds and people are going to die of that. So we're constantly balancing this. And this is one of the parts, this is kind of one of the places we're at with medicine, was what is the ideal dose of blood thinner for a COVID patient? When do we get it? When they're in the hospital or the ICU, to best prevent them from dying of clots. Interesting science right now. So clotting is a significant complication of COVID and cause of death. And right now we're trying to find out the best balance of medication to prevent that so that more people survive.
I wanted to talk today a little bit about the significant issues that we're seeing with regard to inflammation in the body with COVID infection. It is normal for the body to respond to an invading organism, such as a virus or a bacterium, with inflammatory response. The body marshals its defenses and attacks the invading organism, and in so doing creates inflammation. What we are seeing in COVID, however, is that the inflammatory response goes absolutely wild. When that happens, it can affect the entire body, all of the organ systems. In particular, what we're seeing is that it creates some type of injury to the blood vessels. Chronic inflammation, we know, leads to heart disease and is one of the risk factors with regard to stroke. It can cause chronic lung issues as well. In COVID, the inflammatory response is so profound that we are seeing it, in essence, attack these different organ systems. With regard to blood vessels and blood clotting, what we see is that there's actually injury to the blood vessels. And when a blood vessel is injured, it creates this cascade as well of clotting factors that put you at risk for developing blood clots. If you have a blood clot, as Dr. Burchett said, in the lower leg, it's called a DVT, and that DVT can potentially move to the lungs and cause a pulmonary embolism or a blood clot in the lungs. But we also worry about blood clots in organs such as the heart. That's one of the most common reasons to have a heart attack, is that you have developed inflammation within those blood vessels and you can develop a plaque, and then that plaque can break off and it can clot off blood flow to the cardiac muscle, which is in essence a heart attack. If we have significant clotting within the heart or even within the brain, then we can also see things such as stroke. So COVID has put people at significant risk for not only immediate effects of the inflammation that we're seeing, but chronic effects as well. We're seeing folks who were infected 2-3 months ago who are still dealing with that chronic inflammation and show up with a blood clot in the leg or in the lungs, or have some type of cardiac issues. So there's still so much that we need to figure out about this virus. It's new. We are just in the process of studying it. this is what we know right now. We are learning more and more every single day. So as we learn it, we will pass it on to you, but right now we're operating with the best knowledge that we have available to us today. Thank you very much.
For Dr. Jane Jenab and Shovik Banerjee, I'm Dr. Larry Burchett signing off. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the COVID Weekly. Please share it. Interact with the evidence yourself on avropoint.com. As always, stay safe. Do your part. We'll see you next week.